Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this event run by Bright Blue in partnership with Christians Against Poverty, titled Winter is Coming, Tackling Poverty in Tough Times. So, for those who don't know, Bright Blue is an independent, liberal, conservative think tank focusing on several policy areas, including environmental, social, educational, and economic. If you are tweeting about this event, please use hashtag BrightBlue and hashtag CPC22 and follow us at We Are Bright Blue. So, I think it would be fair to say that regardless, before I go on, I'm Anvar, I'm head of research at Bright Blue. For all of us in this room, I'm sure we are aware of the difficult context that is facing many people on low incomes and in poverty in the upcoming winter. It would be unnecessary to discuss the immense challenges in terms of costs of food or price to introduce this topic. But what is also important to contextualize that is that the role of government policy in tackling this, because we have had interventions both during the pandemic and after the pandemic with the cost of living payments, with the energy price guarantee, which have seen the government make substantive interventions. But there is a valid question to ask if those interventions go far enough or support those at the very end, at the very deep end of poverty. And of course, another question to ask is the role of fiscal consolidation that has occurred both in the past, but is now also seems to be occurring again in the near future with the recent discussions about spending cuts. So there's a real question to be had about what exactly is the role of government policy going to be and how it has influenced poverty in the previous years. And finally, of course, the role of voluntary sectoring itself, which has been at the forefront of tackling poverty in all of its forms. So I'll just stop there and introduce the speakers briefly. So, to my right, we have Robin Millar MP, who is the Member of Parliament for Aberconwy and has been a councillor for the 20 years before becoming an MP. To my left, we have Richard Partington, who is the Guardian's economics correspondent. Then, to my further left, we have Emma Revie, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Trussell Trust. And finally, to my immediate left, we have Saima Colossi-Aldrich, who's the Chief Campaigns Director at CBI. On my right, other than Robin Millar, we have Professor Jane Miller, OBE, who's a Professor of Social Policy at the University of Bath. And finally, but not least, we have Gareth McNab, who's the Director of External Affairs at Christians Against Poverty. Robin, would you like to start?
Thank you, and thanks very much for this invitation. It's becoming a bit of a routine for me now that I'm the third choice Conservative MP that gets wheeled out for various reasons, but as I said yesterday in a forum and a panel on sport, it fits my sporting career as well, and usually third choice for those positions too. Look, I'm here as a backbench MP. I am not a government spokesperson. I don't pull those levers that a minister might. And I'm sure that would have been helpful and interesting to you. But what I can say is that I'm pretty average backbench MP who's just struggling to make sense of all of this. It is a chaotic world that we're living in at the moment. There's been huge changes internally within the Conservative Parliamentary Party as well. That's no secret. Announcements this week as well, so changes of direction and course. And all I can really bring to this is that my background as an engineer has been really a focus on what works. And that's what I've brought into politics. And as Anwar mentioned, 20 years as a local councillor has been a fabulous introduction to politics for me, because it's very much the pointy end of things. You can really get, you can wake up on a Monday morning with the idea, and by Friday it's happening. So that hinterland of looking at welfare and looking at how politics impacts on everyday lives has been a huge driver for me, and is very informative for me in terms of where I am. I think it's important because some of the comments I'll hope to make, and will come out perhaps if not in my remarks now in terms of questions, will be more philosophical. And the reason for that is because I think one of the risks at the moment is that poverty is stuck in a very narrow rut of discussion which is purely about a linear measure of finance. I wrote an essay on this. It was, I think the Common Sense Group published it as one of their essays some while ago in a pamphlet, which was all about the poverty line. I'm sure you're familiar with the idea of a poverty line, but may not be familiar with its origins, which are to do with an unwritten, unspoken measure by which children were decided, it was decided whether children in London would be eligible for education. And what's happened over the intervening years, I feel, is a kind of a development of that concept. But anybody who looks at the problems that we face in society, which we class broadly as poverty, will know that a uni-dimensional approach to measuring it just doesn't make sense. In fact, when I talk to most groups who are interested in tackling poverty, there's a very quick consensus on that yes, we can measure income, we can measure revenue, we can measure financial asset, but actually it really doesn't get to the root of the problems. And there's all sorts of other issues with that. So in that paper, one of the things I was suggesting was a more multifaceted, a 5 perspectives approach to poverty. When it comes to things like the cost of living, then as an ordinary backbench MP with a constituency and constituents, Aberconwy in North Wales, I should say, is it's a beautiful place. It has 2/3 of it is within the Snowdonia National Park. The rest of it sits on the North Wales coast, and we have there Llandudno, which is known as the Queen of Resorts. It brings with it the challenges and also the opportunities of a coastal community. So there are pockets of deprivation in there. We have multiple food banks across the constituency working. During the pandemic, it was both a source of concern and also quite inspirational to see how the needs arose and were identified within the community, but also how the community then self-organised and responded to it. A particular area of interest to me in this is how does the state organise and what is the state's role in alleviating poverty? You know, I'm frequently told, well, you know, there are food banks, that's a damning indictment of government. But there's a philosophical question there about what is the balance of the role of community, you know, the Burkean platoons, you might expect the Conservative to talk about those, and also a state-led intervention. When I know from my own experience of working with groups that actually very often the state is something that is avoided by those who need help the most, because we can remove children, we can remove benefits, and we can remove housing. So what I really aim to do, and in coming along and accepting this invitation, albeit on Sunday afternoon, I think it was, that it was first posited by CAP, and thank you for that, that's very kind of you, is I look for places where you can have a thoughtful conversation about poverty, because frankly I don't think anybody's cracked this. I think that's a political statement, a cross-party, but it's also a philosophical one. So that's really where I'm coming from. The problem I'm confronted with is a constituency with pockets of deprivation, but also, if you like, a political one where I'm within a political environment. I recognise that. If you press me on detailed questions about universal credit, I might end up referring you to somebody else, because as a backbench MP, you're bombarded with facts and details and such. You try and sift out what is useful and relevant to the casework that comes across your desk, but you simply can't retain it all. So that's roughly the space I'm in. That's where I'm coming from today. I hope I have something to contribute to the debate, and I'll certainly do my very best.
Thank you, Robin. I won't ask you about the nitty-gritty universal credit details, but I did want to ask you about the aspects of your speech. One is about your discussion about kind of the multifaceted approach, because I think there's an important recognition that many people facing particularly deep poverty often have multiple complex needs, and about kind of the role of government and the extent to which government itself can intervene, given how siloed its approach is to various challenges like housing, health, unemployment, and kind of how can the government facilitate this kind of multifaceted approaches? Okay,
well, so 3 quick observations, not a direct answer, but that's just because 3 quick observations may help move the conversation on. First one is the moral hazard that faces any politician who speaks about poverty. And there's a real concern there that this moral hazard is captured in terms of who gives the most. And that's because traditionally poverty has 3 discourses. You've probably heard this before, but forgive me for those who don't know it. It's really useful. One is what they call the moral underclass discourse, and that is that bad things happen to bad people. So poverty is because of bad choices you've made or because you're a bad person, broadly. And you might say that that was the view, I don't know, 120, 150 years ago. You know, bad things happen to bad people. If you've done well in society, it's because you're a good person. Although I would warn anybody to be careful, because I think there are echoes of that in society today, and an assumption of middle-class goodness. And that all of us are vulnerable to that. These are human psychological reactions. So that's one discourse. Another is what they call the redistributive discourse. You know, crudely tax and spend. There's money over here in society, and it's the state's job to redistribute that money to another part of society. And that's where I think probably the dominant discourse is, and that's where I talk about this moral hazard, because there's a moral high ground attached to we're better people because we want to give more. And I catch that as a conservative because I'm told you don't want to give more, therefore you're a bad person, you're a nasty person. And I think that's damaging for several reasons. One is because it shuts people up. That if you're genuinely concerned about poverty, genuinely concerned about improving people's well-being, shutting up another argument, I would suggest, is not a constructive way forward for it. So there's some real dangers there. Another one is a very simple point. The weakness of a moral argument is if you want to make it a moral argument, then explain to me geographical limits on morals. Because if there aren't, and if you believe that morals are absolute, then you have to start asking the question, okay, this is all relative. In the UK, we are in the top 5-10% of the world. So actually the real and pressing question about poverty is not between what's happening between different areas within our own country, it's what's happening globally between the West and the UK and other countries. Why are we not having that same conversation with the same vigour? So there's real dangers in pursuing some of these positions, which end up, I think, diminishing the argument and the debate that we can have. I think there was a third point in there as well, but it escapes my mind at the moment. So as a politician approaching it, as I say, there is real risk that we've closed down the debate to being just about how do we redistribute. The third point I would say in that analysis of discourses is to talk about social inclusion. And this was something I think the Blair government really started to shift the dial towards. The ideas of opportunity, and you might argue, I would probably echo this, that the Johnson administration, the view of levelling up, and it's certainly one that resonates with me in North Wales, which feels overlooked and underfunded, to use a soundbite, by two sets of government, both London and Cardiff. The Welsh population is concentrated in South Wales. That idea of levelling up and creating opportunity actually really resonates very strongly. So that idea of a social inclusion discourse is one that naturally I'm more drawn to. But then, and perhaps you want me to mention Kwasi, when Kwasi made the statement in the House on the Friday about growth, I had the opportunity to question him afterwards, and I don't think I'm revealing any secrets here, so I don't think there's any scoop if your pen is poised. But I said to him, so Kwasi, help me out here, what is your view then? Is this a social inclusion discourse, or is this a redistributive discourse that you think we're pursuing? And as we kicked it around between us, actually the evidence is it's both, because we've done some of the biggest cash transfers and spending as a government in decades, through the 60 billion that's gone out in energy payments, the 400 billion that went out through the pandemic. And that's because of what he calls these exogenous shocks, these external factors which have driven it. Announcements, timing, effect on markets aside, I think those are pretty robust points. So there is a heck of a lot of redistribution that's happened. But also his strong point to me was, Robin, growth equals opportunity. So as a backbencher looking at a government and not just reciting a line, I'm looking at the government to say, okay, I want to see that growth produce opportunity for my constituents in Aberconwy in North Wales. I probably didn't answer your question, so forgive me.
Thank you very much, Rowan. We'll now move on to Richard now.
Thank you very much. And thank you, first of all, for having me here. At Bright Blue, an organisation I've worked with a number of times, at The Guardian, and Christians Against Poverty as well, an organisation, again, I've worked very closely with, who've been invaluable as the eyes and ears of a journalist to sort of connect me with people who you support with debt advice and the research that you provide to us as well. So, from my perspective as a journalist, now I've been writing on economics at The Guardian for 5 years. Before that, I wrote about finance for Bloomberg News. We've been through a succession of economic shocks. Most recently, of course, the cost of living crisis, but before that, COVID, and before that, 2008 financial crisis, which I don't feel we have ever really sort of recovered from, seeing the back of the consequences of that. The issues that we see now, can be traced back to those times where we had a very weak decade of wage growth after the 2008 financial crisis. Productivity growth has stalled. Economic growth has been meagre in contrast to the typical sort of 2% growth rate that we saw in the early part of this century. And those things have created a huge amount of problems. Tax hitting the highest levels as a proportion of GDP to pay for a larger welfare state that we need to have to support people through these difficult times, and people not having their own money to their own agency to get through these difficult moments as well. The shocks that we went through, the COVID pandemic and then the cost of living crisis, have disproportionately impacted those at the bottom end of the income distribution, the poorest in society. First of all, during the COVID pandemic, a lot of us know, working from home during that moment, in professional occupations, higher paying jobs, there was a glut of savings that was built up. Bank of England estimates more than £200 billion from people not commuting to work, spending money on food and drink, going on holiday, and that has provided a safety net for a lot of people. But it was concentrated in the upper half of the income distribution and in cities, in urban locations and higher paying jobs, whereas the bottom end of the income distribution was more likely to be affected with job losses, more likely to be on furlough, and more likely to be disproportionately hit in terms of their finances. Come to the cost of living crisis, and the same happens again. We have soaring energy prices and the price of food and drink, cost of basic essentials in the shops. That is the type of thing that makes up a larger part of the disposable expenditure of households, the lower income households. Some research from Progressive Economy Forum that I was writing about recently estimates that even after the government's intervention to cap average prices at £2,500, the poorest tenth will still face bills getting on towards half of their disposable income. So, given the nature of these shocks, we're arriving at a very delicate political moment where there's been a change in direction from the government, as we're hearing about. The Prime Minister clearly talking about, not focusing on a redistributive fight over what's left from the proceeds of growth and talking about growing the economy instead. But so far, I don't think that the Prime Minister has set out policies that will clearly make a link to growing the economy in the way that I think a lot of us would like to see, and that there has been distractions, as the Chancellor put them yesterday, of the 45p fight, which clearly was a redistributive policy, that now there has been a welcome change in direction on. There will be more to come in terms of this. I mean, we're hearing today about the uprating of universal credit benefits and the debates about that. Once again, that there is an issue for the poorest in society who are more likely to be in receipt of universal credit, and they have 40% of those people being in work, and another proportion, again, are people who would not be deemed by the government as having to work, people who have disabilities or caring responsibilities or other reasons why they might not want to work. So I think that this is a particularly challenging moment. I mean, I agree on the focus on growing the economy, and that will help to alleviate poverty over the longer term. But I think that there needs to still be a focus on some of the ways in which the poorest in society can be helped through this shock. And I don't think that's particularly unconservative either. I write for a left-wing paper, but I think that there are voices to the centre of the Conservative Party that have a particular view on the need to uprate benefits in line with inflation. I've just come from a fringe event with Ian Duncan-Smith, architect of universal credit, who was saying that he thinks it would be wrong to not increase benefits in line with inflation. And also that if we are to have a government that is focused on growth, that those at the lower end of the income distribution, the poorest in society, are more likely to go out and spend that money in the economy. So it is a challenging time. There are different debates about the way in which the economy can be grown and the proceeds of it shared. And I think I'm interested to see what the outcomes on this panel are, and that this conference here in Birmingham, these couple of days are going to show us about the path forward.
Thank you, Richard, very much. We'll turn to Gareth now.
Thanks, Anvar. Thanks to the panellists who've gone before me, and thanks to you all for coming. I want to talk to you a little bit about who we are and what we do, just in case you don't know. I want to talk to you about some of the problems that we see at Christians Against Poverty, and then I want to tell you why this is really personal for me, why it's political for you,
and some of the potential that I see. Everything starting with P, could be a politician. So Christians Against Poverty, we're a charity that works with thousands of churches right around all 4 nations of the UK to help people out of debt and poverty and the challenges that come with those things. It's a joy to partner with the UK Church because there's a church pretty much in every single community around the country, which means that our transforming service is able to reach people face to face in those communities, the way that we know is the very best way to deliver people help that really helps. We provide churches with various services and tools to do this well. You've heard panellists mention our free debt advice service available right across the UK. We also offer the skills clubs and courses, jobs clubs for people who are long-term unemployed, life skills for people living life on a persistently low budget, and financial education, face-to-face financial education. Actually, we're the biggest provider of face-to-face financial education in the UK. We take calls from and support thousands of people every year. It's getting harder, though. Those calls increasingly feature disclosures of really poor mental health, safeguarding issues in families, and suicidality. There's been a 30% increase in the last year, and the stories we hear day in, day out are terrifying. Our safeguarding team received 5 call-ins, come and help me on this call last September. We're up to 200 this month. Leave that with you. It's sobering, isn't it? It's really not unusual to speak to people who've got nothing left in their house. Let me tell you something else terrifying. We spoke to someone recently who had no kettle, no fridge, and no cooker. They'd sold them to buy food and pay their rent. And that didn't matter all that much because they couldn't afford the energy bill to turn the cooker or the kettle on in the first place. And friends, that's not rare. I've not cherry-picked the very worst story to tell you. I'm telling you a recent, from the last couple of weeks, story. Living is costing absolutely everything for far too many people, and it's just not okay. We help 16,000 people a year in situations like this, but millions in our country are living that reality. Many of you will realise, though, that this cost of living crisis that feels quite recent is actually long running. As far back as 2014, 7 in 10 of the people seeking help from us had been regularly sacrificing meals before seeking help from us to get them debt-free. Polling with YouGov that we released recently found there's 8.5 million people in the UK in that situation right now. A fifth of UK adults in financial trouble struggling to keep up with the rising cost of living, and a further 35% just about coping but will be at risk as costs rise further. And as welcome as government intervention on the energy price guarantee is, energy bills for the typical household are still double what they were at this point last year, and incomes aren't, are they? There'll be some other stats that I can drop in later in comments, but let me tell you, why is this personal? Let me give you another story. There's a 73-year-old woman, probably watching me on YouTube now. Hi, Mum. She suffers with osteoporosis and anxiety, so struggles to get out, but also struggles in the home that she's in. The home she's in is not suitable for an older woman with mobility issues, but she can't move. She's in private rented accommodation. It's an old stone cottage in South Wales, Robin. But because it's rented, she can't insulate it. She's got no ability to do anything about her boiler or energy efficiency. Her energy bills hit £600 a month in the summer. And the way that we are seeking to address that is seriously considering whether she should move in with us and sleep on our sofa bed. It's a woman who's had 2 hip replacements, sleeping on a sofa bed to survive the winter. So this is personal for me, and I imagine there's people in the room it's personal for you too. I think that's why the cost of living crisis has the energy on it that poverty hasn't in political discourse in the last few years, is because the reality of life is beginning to hit hard for people in this room, people watching online, and people in our families and communities. Here's why it's a political problem for you, though. Christians Against Poverty supporters, financial, more than 80% of our income comes from generous life changers who give regularly, monthly, to cover the costs of our work. And those who support us with their time, our volunteers, they lean conservative. It's been their joy to work out their Christian faith and their conservative values by working hard in their local communities to help people in need. And 5 to 10 years ago, the help that they delivered made a material difference and transferred somebody from darkness into light, from no hope into hope. But increasingly now, even after our debt advice, up to half of our clients, after we've maximised their income, reduced their expenditure, don't have anything left for us to even negotiate with their creditors. That typical budget is £200 to £250 a month light on income for even the basics before we start trying to help people get debt-free. That's a political problem for you, though, as a Conservative party, because these people who lean Conservative and give their time and money alongside the third sector to solve some of these social problems are increasingly seeing that the problem is not within society necessarily. The income aspect that we've touched on is increasingly just totally insufficient. And so while I hear the arguments and I welcome Robin's appetite to have a thoughtful conversation, we really can't have it that when we say it's more than just income, that shuts down the income side of the consideration. It has to be part of it, and I'm certain it'll have been part of your multivalent approach. So why is this personal? It's political. There's potential, though. The supply side reform that we've heard a lot about in the last couple of weeks has got potential to move the dial on some of this, because if we can get housing costs down, we can also get the welfare spending on housing-related benefits down. I mean, you could just cut them, but you really shouldn't. You could reduce them by addressing some of this supply side reform. I've been at a number of panel events talking about prevention, particularly in the health service, that one way to reduce the cost would be to invest in prevention. Less than 5% of the spending of the NHS is invested in actual health, in prevention of poor health. And with the white paper on health disparities being reportedly shelved or binned, I think that's problematic. I think the cost of that could be reduced. And so I'm excited by the opportunities here, but I'm also concerned at the not quite joining things up. The growth agenda is great because a rising tide lifts all boats, but I care very deeply about those people who can't afford a boat, and we've got to do something about that. And the other thing that could be happening that isn't is the political noise. We've got to offer people hope, haven't we? And even debating uprating of social security by inflation and failing to come out quickly and say, of course we would, why the heck would we not, causes such despair among low-income households that we're even questioning it. We could offer them hope even today with the third U-turn of the week and quickly commit to treat people fairly, to consider all people as part of a society that wants to be fair, generous and enable everybody to participate. I've obviously got lots more to say, but that'll come up later.
Thank you very much, Gareth, both for sharing the very difficult stories people are facing right now, but especially your mother, but also focusing on kind of the longer term challenges around health, around housing, which do fit into not just the immediate income boost, but also around the supply side reform and around reform of healthcare. We would like to, Professor Jane Millar, please.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the opportunity to come along. It's really nice to be here. I was saying it's nice to be in a room with people rather than talking to people virtually, right. So it's good to be here. We were posed quite a lot of questions. I wanted to focus on question 4, what can governments do about poverty? And as we've already been hearing, we're clearly facing a very challenging winter coming up. We sometimes hear that phrase about people choosing between heating or eating, but as Gareth's just made clear, that's not the half of it, really. People are having to make very hard choices. There are many people already in or close to poverty having to choose between paying their rent or their mortgages, between paying bills, between paying for school uniforms and meals, between paying debts and credit cards, selling things, replacing things that are broke, and so on. I could go on. There's a lot of people in very difficult circumstances. And families with children are one of the groups that are particularly hard hit. We already have 3.9 million children living in income poverty. That's 27%. I can go into definitions later if you want, but that's 27% of all children. 8 children in a class of 30. Just think of that around the country and in our schools. And among families, it is large families, families with 3 or more children. It is lone parent families, and it is families with a disability or a long-term illness or ill health for themselves or their parents or their children that are particularly at risk. So there are certain groups particularly at risk of poverty. Many of those families are already working, but they are families that face challenges in working and in combining work and caring. And this is not due to their motivation or their attitudes to work. It's more to do with the gap between what they can do in the labour market and what jobs are available and out there and the sort of hours of work and the possibilities that are open to them. So it's not a question of motivation, I think. So I think we need to target support on families with children. And we should do this, I think, by a mixture of cash payments and measures that will reduce the costs for families. So I've got cash payments and measures that will reduce costs for families. Cash payments are important. That was one of the questions on the list. Cash payments are important. They give people some control over their spending so they can work out how to balance their income and their needs. People on low incomes are pretty good managers, but when they just don't have enough, as Gareth has been talking, there's only so far you can go. But people need to have that choice and to be able to make those decisions. Money's also spent by poor families on their families. We've got lots of evidence to show that. They spend it on children's needs, children's clothing, on food, on improving the quality of the food they can offer to their children and so on. So they spend it well, typically. And also it's good for the economy. I think Richard said this, you know, poor people spend their money. Rich people save their money, poor people spend it. If we want to get the economy going, we need to get more spending out there as well. So more money is very, very important. I think there are two, from my research, I've been a researcher many years with families living on social security benefits, including at the moment families on universal credit. And I think there's two things that we need, two principles or two goals. One's about income adequacy. Have we got enough money to meet basic needs? So that's an important principle. And the other is about income security. I mean, Gareth touched on this a bit. The despair, the mental health, the worrying, the constant wearing down of people when they don't know that their incomes are unreliable. So when incomes fluctuate, people don't know how much they're going to get. It's very, very challenging for people to manage that. So having a low income and an unpredictable income is a horrible combination. If you think about it, it's really, really difficult for people to manage in those circumstances. So what should we do for cash? Well, the first one, I think, is fairly obvious and being debated and already mentioned. We've got to raise benefits, at least by inflation, possibly more. And that's an ongoing discussion. I very much agree with Gareth's point that, you know, in a way we shouldn't even be debating it. We should just be saying this is the appropriate and the right thing to do. How can we expect that people can can manage if we're not even matching some of that increase in prices? So at least inflation, possibly more. And actually get the inflation number a bit closer to the income, the time when benefits are rise, you know, because we set inflation 6 months ago and then we say raise your benefits now. We need to get them a bit closer in timing. So a bit better matching of the inflation rate. So raise benefits at least by inflation. Then my second one is increased child benefit. Child benefit is the benefit that is our society's contribution to children. It's a sharing of the costs of children between parents and society. So it's for all children, not quite now because there's a cap on it, but almost all children. If you raise it by £10 per child per week, you're going to raise at least 500,000 children out of poverty, and the cost is about £6 billion. I think that's a price worth paying for thinking about the future of our children. So raise child benefit. Or go for the Scotland. Scotland have got the child payment. The Scottish child payment is £25 per child per week. So it's an important increase. Did I say raise it by £10 per month? I meant £10 per week if I said per month. So raise child benefit. Then there's two measures that particularly affect large families and I think we should abolish. The 2-child limit, which limits the amount of benefit that you can get. If you have a third child, you don't get an increase in the amount of benefit. We should get rid of that. 200,000 families, so it's not a large number, but they're families who are very, very poor. So this would make a big difference to them. And also the benefit cap. So the benefit caps how much that you can get, again, for families with children. Again, the cost of doing that is about 500 million, but these are really poor families, and you could raise their incomes by about £65 a week. So abolish those two measures that are really bad for the poorest families. What about removing costs? What can we do to remove some of the costs for families? Well, one's about childcare. We've got a very good free childcare offer at the moment, so we do offer support for childcare, and it's very popular with parents. It's well taken up and well used, unlike the childcare and universal credit, which is hardly used at all and very complex to get. So extend our free childcare and make sure schools are offering childcare provisions in the mornings and after school. Secondly, free school meals. We heard a lot about free school meals last winter. It was one that was on the political debate. It still remains important. The Dimbleby report, the Henry Dimbleby report on the food strategy, suggested that we needed to raise the eligibility condition so that to bring more families into free school meals. And if we do that, we can bring in an extra 1.1 million children into free school meals. And a hot meal every day for children, really important. So free school meals. Longer term, so they're my two, removing some of the costs that families face. My longer term point that I'll finish on, and I think we need to start now, is we need to really tackle, and I think it picks up Robin's point, we really need a serious debate and discussion about how we're going to tackle child poverty. We need to think about a child poverty strategy. It was something that the all-party Select Committee on Work and Pensions called for recently. So a new approach to tackling child poverty and thinking about child poverty in all its forms and what can we do to tackle it. It's about the future. That's the sort of investment that I think is really important to make. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Millar, and thank you for highlighting both kind of the ways to address issues with child poverty, both in terms of income, both in terms of addressing costs and thinking about the longer term. Moving on, Simon, Colossi Aldridge, please.
Thank you. And what you can see me doing here is frantically scribbling some extra notes, so I'm so inspired by what Jane was saying. Thanks for having me today. I'm Simon from the CBI. You might be wondering why a business group is sitting on a panel talking about this stuff, but this is very important. All of our members are employers. They employ a lot of people who are facing lots of the issues that we've been talking about today, to Richard's point. It is important for people to have money to spend in the economy. And when I talk to members, the cost of living and the cost of doing business are the things that they raise with me as amongst the most important things for them, because it's what their employees are talking about, and it's the things that they're facing in the boardrooms. So that is why the CBI is here. What I was going to talk about was a little bit about the current situation, more around the cost of doing business and the impact that that has on prices, and then think about some of the longer term solutions, some of which have been covered so far. Growth is a necessary precondition to improving living standards, to bringing down the cost of doing business, to raising living standards, and reducing the impacts of the cost of living crisis. Businesses are also facing inflation. That has an impact on prices. Businesses are also facing higher input costs. That has an impact on prices. Businesses are facing things like business rates, which is a pre-profit tax, which is passed on 15p in the pound on average. So there are things that government could be doing around those aspects that will have an impact on prices. Businesses are doing a lot to shield passing on prices to consumers, because people, it has to be affordable, it has to be realistic as much as possible. But there is, you were saying earlier, Rich, it's quite sobering that we are in an economic situation now. We're going to be in a different economic situation next year. So it's important to think about that. Businesses are also doing a lot to support they are doing a lot to support their workers, to support their staff, to support their customers. They did so during the pandemic, and now it's important. If you're a business in the room, I would encourage you to make sure you are doing that stuff. The CBI has put a whole bunch of stuff on their website about how you can support your employees through cost of living. It's definitely worth a look. Lots of them are raising salaries, lots of them are providing one-off payments to staff, continuing pension payments when employees can't, but this is assuming that this is people in work. But business also knows that putting the UK economy on a sustainable path requires growth. We need growth to support public services, to pay down debt, to keep the tax burden affordable. And this is the reality in which we're operating in. But not all firms realistically can give pay rises in line with inflation, because that's just, if you're a business who is struggling to pay your energy bills and to pay your input costs, to pay our wages, that is the reality of what some businesses are facing. So, coming back to growth and productivity, these are the important things to look at. In terms of the longer term, Jane talked about some of this already. There are measures outside of welfare that levers that government should be looking at pulling to improve this for the future. Increasing people's living standards through work and employment is one of them. We've got to remove barriers to work, helping people to re-enter the workforce, helping people to up and reskill where necessary. So labour market activation is a key thing here. health prevention. Someone was talking about that earlier on, the amount of money that's spent on health prevention. You know, could you do more to, you know, make sure our workforce is healthy so people are able to work? Childcare interventions, we have amongst the highest childcare costs in the OECD. If you have 2 kids, you can expect to spend about a quarter of your wages on childcare. That is a lot. So if people are going into work and, you know, having to pay those childcare costs, wages have to be at a certain level. So we need to have a certain kind of growth. There are also, I've talked about business rates, there are tax blockers which impact cost and cost of living that it's important to look at. And then on the skill side, reforming the apprenticeship levy, it might sound that's something that isn't related to the cost of living, but it is related to the cost of living, because if you want to get back into work and you need to reskill to do so, you need a skills framework that is going to allow you to re-enter a workforce in that way. And just finally, just talking about energy costs a little bit as well, because it's very front and centre, and I think it was Gareth who was saying that we are capping at a certain level, and you're using the example of your mum. Energy costs are still high, and there are things around energy efficiency where government could be, and industry and landlords and everybody could be taking more action to tackle not only energy costs but demand. So you can bring down costs by reducing demand, by which I mean it's not that you have to turn off your heating, but it's that you heat your home more efficiently. Your home is more thermally efficient. We have proposed, ECO is the energy company obligation, we proposed something called Eco Plus, so you turbocharge how you make the UK more energy efficient. We have some of the oldest and leakiest homes in the UK. Gareth was talking about some of the issues around the private rented sector as well. There are levers that government and industry can be pulling in this place, and I would encourage them to do so. Energy efficiency reduces consumption and waste, but it also reduces costs. And people are spending a lot of their costs, household costs, on energy bills. All of this also costs money. So coming back to growth and coming back to the importance of improving outcomes and accelerating growth in a way that is sustainable. That's it from me.
Thank you very much, and I think what was good is just bringing out the business side of things and how the recent inflation pressures have fed through to people in lowest incomes, not just directly but indirectly, exactly through the kind of mechanisms you were discussing. And finally, we have Emma, who from Trussell Trust.
Apologies for arriving a little late. I was running from our own panel event, but thank you so much for the invitation to be part of this incredibly important conversation. And for those of you who don't know, Trust, we support a network of just under 1,400 food bank centres around the UK to provide 3 days of emergency food to people who are referred to them because they can't afford to buy food. We provide other support, and together we campaign for a UK without the need for food banks, where everyone's able to afford the essentials. And the title for our session today, Winter is Coming, feels very prescient for us and our food bank network. Last year we provided 2.1 million emergency food parcels to people in crisis, 800,000 of those to children, to pick up on what Professor Millar was saying a moment ago. But need is accelerating, and if we look over the last 3 quarters, we're seeing a steep acceleration in the number of people who are having to come to food banks. One chart that I see that tracks monthly need that has really been keeping me up of a night is we're seeing levels of need in August and September that are the same as we saw in January. And for those of you who know about pressures in food banks, normally it's much quieter in the summer where people aren't having to spend as much on their energy costs, those impossible decisions. People can keep their energy costs low and prioritise food and other bills. And already we're seeing levels equivalent to January. So when I look forward to winter, and winter is coming, I'm very worried. But more importantly, people who are coming to our food banks tell us that they are scared. They're scared now, and they are very scared about what's coming in the months ahead. We've seen unprecedented levels of intervention from government, and I think it's really important to recognise that. The scale of this crisis coming hotly on the heels of the pandemic, where again the government had to step in unprecedented ways. these are huge numbers of investment that the government have stepped in with the cost of living payments. But what does that look like for people on the lowest incomes? So we did a piece of research with YouGov in August, and the first cost of living payment to people was made, everyone on universal credit received that payment in July, and we surveyed people on universal credit in August with YouGov. And what we found was that 40% of people on universal credit had skipped meals or gone whole days without food in that month. We find that 21% of people told us they hadn't been able to cook their food in that month. So 1 in 5 people on universal credit. But most concerning was when asked about the payment they'd received the month before, 70% of people were able to tell us that they had used that payment in its entirety. When we asked them what that payment had been used for, the number one reason was used on food. Second item was on personal hygiene items. So that money was absolutely the right thing, targeted in exactly the right place, but it was gone. And therefore not preparing a buffer for the winter ahead, but actually just meeting the needs that people had in that month, and it's gone. And so anecdotally, when we're speaking to our food banks, we saw a slight dip in need in July, right back up and to higher levels again in August. So we know the kind of intervention that gets the money to people so as they can use it to cover these essential items. But we are also clear from that it's not enough, and it's not filling that gap that has been created by this incredible inflationary increase in the cost of essential items and the impact that that's having on people on the lowest incomes. So how do we tackle poverty in these tough times? And what has worked? Well, we've learned something there about how we target that intervention. But I think it's important to look at what we know about what drives things like food bank use. And one of the key things we know is that 95% of people coming to food banks are experiencing destitution, which is they don't have enough money for all of those essential items to stay warm, to be fed, to be sheltered. And this study that we did, a State of Hunger study, is done over 3 years with Heriot-Watt University. It's the largest longitudinal study into drivers of food insecurity and hunger in our country. And knowing that that correlation is almost absolute between food bank use and destitution tells us something about what's happening with people on the lowest incomes in our country. What we also find out is that 62%, so 2/3 of people coming to food banks and experiencing destitution were disabled or living with a lifelong illness that was affecting their daily lives. So that's 3 times the rate in which disabled people are represented within the working age population. We also know that 1 in 5 people were lone parent households. Again, twice as much as they're represented within the general population. So there are particular groups of people, and I think it's important to draw this line here, particular groups of people for whom there are greater barriers to moving into employment. So around disability and around caring responsibilities that are being overrepresented, significantly overrepresented within the food bank population. And therefore, when we're talking about strategies for tackling this, they can't all be about work, because for some people it's not possible to work at all or more hours potentially. And I think we need to be frank that it's insufficient income that is driving food bank use. People not being able to afford those essentials. The average household income of somebody coming to a food bank is just £57 a week after housing costs. So £57 a week for everything else. So some of the things we need to do to tackle, I think, first and foremost, it's been said by many panellists already, we need to ensure that our social security system, that our benefits keep track with the rate of inflation. We need to be reviewing how quickly that happens, and I think absolutely what Gareth said really struck me. We can't afford for there to be any equivocation around this, because it causes real fear for a group of people who are already feeling very scared about the winter ahead. But there are things within the system we can also tackle. So it's about people holding on to the money they receive through benefits. And we know, many of you will know, that there is a 5-week wait when you first come onto universal credit. And the government's response to bridging that 5-week wait was to provide an advance on benefits, which does bridge that 5-week gap. However, that advance is then deducted from benefits. So that debt is taken back through future payments. And what we know from our research is that 47% of people referred to food banks are in debt to the DWP. So that deduction is not affordable. That deduction is causing people to be unable to afford essential items. And just in the last 3 months, 58% of people claiming universal credit who had deductions taken from their payment had to skip meals, compared to 35% of people who had not had deductions taken from them having to skip meals. So it's a really material gap, and deductions is something we can do something about in how we operate our benefit system. I think we can do something to help people maximise their income. There's a lot of benefits that are underclaimed. And so looking at ways in which we are looking at that as a food bank network, how can we get the right specialist advice to people in crisis to ensure that they are getting everything they're entitled to? It's complex to navigate. We know that 75% of people coming to our food banks are struggling with their mental health. And it's really difficult to deal with complexity when you're struggling with your mental health. So how do we provide that targeted support to ensure people hold on and actually hold on to their maximum income, but also gain their maximum income? Local crisis support. We've seen a significant investment from government in household support fund, £1 billion since October last year, another 500 million from October. And local authorities in some areas are doing amazing things with that, ensuring that cash gets into the hands of people who need it. But because it's short-term funding, it's done in a blast. For many local authorities, they're often coming to us and saying, would you like that for food banks? And we're saying, no. That money needs to get to people who need the cash so as they can go to the supermarket and buy their food. So we need an investment from government that's over a longer term, so as local authorities can strategically think about how they can support people they know are most vulnerable in their communities. So I think there's nothing I'm saying here that isn't also important outside of a crisis. So these are things we're learning in tough times as winter is coming that puts pressure on us to have to do these things, and we need to do them now. But also these are important principles, I think, for how we ensure our social security system works for everyone all the time. That if you lose your job, if you become unwell, if you're disabled, if you have caring responsibilities, you will be held out of destitution. And I think that's what we all want from our social security system.
Thank you very much, Emma. And I mean, there's a lot of ground that you covered, and just wanted to highlight both the discussion about disability, which I think is a really important one, because there's been so much focus on people who are unemployed, whereas a lot of issues is around inactivity for people who are unable to work, or where it's much more difficult to get them into work. So I think that's another important dimension to this. So now we'll move on to the Q&A. For those viewing through YouTube, you're able to ask questions through the Slido link that's located below the video player. So please ask your questions there, stating your name and where you're from. For the audience here, so I'll take questions in groups of 3 if you just want to raise your hand up, and importantly, wait for the microphone to come to you before, so that our live stream audience can hear your question. And then if speakers on the panel can volunteer which kind of questions they want to ask, and then we can cover the ground. So anyway, could I have some hands up, please? Yes, this lady here first, then you gentlemen, and then the lady behind.
Sorry. Hi, I've got a question for Robin. You said at the beginning that you think organisations like food banks could have a role in the community when it comes to supporting people rather than the state. As Emma will know, food banks are running out of food. So at what point, what do you expect families to do if the charity sector doesn't work and benefits aren't enough? Do you think then the government has to step in? And just following that up, you say that growth is really important, but obviously the government's growth plan may mean that public services are cut back, and that means that benefits might be cut back. So I just wanted to get a sense, what are people supposed to do if food banks are empty and their benefits being cut? That's just what I wanted to know, your general approach on that at the moment.
And just, could you identify yourself, please?
Yeah, my name's Nadine Batchelor-Hunt and I work at Yahoo.
Thank you. Then the gentleman here.
My name's Dylan Jeffrey. I'm the Chief Whip at Kent County Council. I also work for the Catholic Church 1 day a week. I've got Two questions. One is around how much of this needs to be direct interventionist strategy by government, and how much of this is about societal issues in terms of society being broken, which we've tried to address over a number of years. Because as has been rightly identified by Gareth, the number of donors is dwindling, but then again that could be linked into attendance at church, etc., and the responsibility of society as a whole to do more. So how much this is a wider issue, as opposed to just saying it's government's job, get on with it, and not take direct responsibility as a society. Second point is about what can be done, and one of my big fears is, for example, in I've got a couple of church halls, and heating and fuel has gone up quadrupled. Now we don't get any VAT breaks on that, so we're 5%. Yes, 5% break is less than the standard VAT, but nonetheless we provide a winter shelter, we provide a food stop, we provide a club for the mature and wise, and essentially we're going to be facing a massive increase in our bills from around 8,000-9,000 up towards 50,000 in terms of cost this year, which is actually going to create a lot of extra money for the government in terms of VAT. Perhaps that could be a break where charities and others are actually doing the work. That's an area where it could be done, as well as supporting those businesses that perhaps struggling with fuel as well. But where they're making a direct impact, something could be done around VAT on fuel for charities.
Right. Thank you. And there's a lady just behind him.
Hi, my name's Hannah Swirsky. I'm from the Samaritans. We're very much seeing an impact on people's mental health as a result of the cost of living, and we know that there is a link between recession and suicide rates and an increase in suicide rates. So I'd just be interested to hear from the panel how you think we can embed suicide prevention work within poverty alleviation work and supporting people with the cost of living.
Thank you very much. Robin, I think there was a question quite pointedly at you, so I'll let you take that first.
Yeah. So I think, Nadine, you were responding to my comment about the balance between the state and community. I think I will start with a philosophical point. It is a very pointed one, but there's a philosophical point there, I think, which is important, which is we mustn't remove from society the dignity of help, and that dignity which comes from being able to help one another. And I say those words carefully, but in some of the communities I've worked in, some of the poorest in the country, I've found actually that there is a huge importance in, let me not use vague words. We've got to be very careful we don't tell people who are in a disadvantaged state that they can't help other people. So when I've worked in some poor communities, it's been very important for them to be able to help one another. And this is important when we think about the state as being the last resort, if you like, because what that assumes is that actually we're all passive recipients, or someone who is poor is in a state of passive recipients, passive receipt of benefit or goodness. But what I'm very keen to do is that should not steamroller, the state's role should not steamroller the individual human dignity that comes from helping others around us. Now, that's a kind of a philosophical point. Forgive me if that's not as eloquently put as it might have been. But then when we come to the question of what's going to happen if, clearly the state should be and is the place of last resort. That's what we're talking about today. That's why we've had the crisis already through the pandemic. We've had the immediate energy bills crisis. And there are problems coming up. And I have to say at this point, because I'm not in government, I'm not one of the ministers who's having those discussions, I don't know what they're discussing about that. But the pattern is there, clearly, that this is a government which does act and respond to this level of need in society. And I'm grateful to my fellow panellists here for acknowledging that. The debate then becomes, well, what might it be or how could it be? And at this stage, we don't know. But to your point, yes, there is absolutely a role for the state to help and respond. I thought your points, Professor Millar, by the way, we're not related, if anybody's there is absolutely a point about cash. There's absolutely a point about reducing costs as well. So the state has got to think, the government has got to think about these things for sure. But if I can use a very specific example, I'm taking quite a long time, but in California, I think it was during the time of the Obama administration, there was a move to ask everybody filing state taxes to declare how much money they gave to charity. And the thinking, it didn't happen, but the thinking was, if we can add up how much people give to charity, then we know actually how much we should be spending on the state. And the assumption behind that was one of the state should be trying to catch everything. And I just fundamentally don't believe that's possible, and I don't believe it's within human nature. And that's back to my first point. Actually, I think it crushes something of our dignity and pride, and our sense of who we are, the ability to help others, no matter what our condition. I hope that sort of strikes somewhere to where you're hoping. Growth, yes, growth is important, and the opportunities that come through that. I don't see it as simplistically as linking growth to cuts in benefits. Those are two slightly different arguments. I wouldn't even say they're flip sides of the same coin, but the question about what happens to benefits and decisions made about that, which are to do with funding, they are important, yeah.
Right. Thank you, Robin. And yes, Anna.
I'm just saying I'm happy to also respond if that's helpful, but I think Gareth maybe moved his hand.
I was wondering different answers, so and I'll take Gareth then, yes.
So I think it's a really good question around the role of the state versus the role of the third sector, and I also absolutely recognise that point around agency and co-producing solutions and being in control of solutions that are affecting communities that are directly affected by poverty. We have 40,000 volunteers that run our food bank network. I just can't begin to imagine what we could do in our local communities if their hours weren't spent collecting, dating and mass distributing food aid to people in our communities. The radical welcome people experience when they come through the door of a food bank, which they may not have faced when going through any other door for support. That cup of tea, that sitting down and having a chat, people tell me all the time makes a massive difference to how they're feeling and the support they're able to access. There's lots of other things we can do, and we do. So we ensure that there is signposting and specialist advice work that goes on in our food banks. And I think we need to hold our part of providing solutions as a third sector organisation. However, what you will hear if you speak to any volunteer in our food bank is how inadequate a food parcel is to the problem that people are presenting with. There's this video of one of our food bank managers that we captured, and that still sits with me, Dominic, talking about through the pandemic particularly, but also the cost of living crisis, just feeling like, is this all I can give? If somebody can't afford food, that means they're also probably struggling with their heating bills. They're struggling to cover the cost of their accommodation. They're struggling to pay their kids' school shoes and the school trips, and a food parcel is not going to cut it. So when you know what the nature of the problem is, insufficient income, the very most we're able to provide at a food bank is a sticking plaster. So it's not the right solution. So I think we can be focusing on the stuff that we do really well, which is providing community, providing support, solidarity, safe spaces and warm places of welcome. But if we're providing the mass distribution of food aid with that resource, and it's not fit for purpose to the problem at hand, then I think that is when we look to the state to say, how could the state be better placed to intervene and ensure people have money to afford the essentials?
Can I just really quickly come in on Hannah's question about the work that you're doing at the Samaritans, which is really amazing and brilliant, important work. Something that we've done at the CBI, I mentioned our cost of doing business and how to support your employees hub. There is actually a section in there on mental health for your workforce, and how that is something that employers should be looking at for all of the reasons that you suggest. I want to just provide you that reassurance, but I will definitely take it back and see what else we can do.
Gareth, I know you wanted to make a contribution.
I would absolutely agree with Emma. Wouldn't it be amazing if community spirit wasn't helping people survive, but was actually helping people thrive? Wouldn't it be great if communities were coming together to celebrate the good in their community rather than to make sure people don't die of hunger and cold? I'm glad that people do that in the hardest of times. We shouldn't be in the hardest of times in the fifth or sixth largest economy in the world, and so. I think I probably agree with where the question is coming from. And I don't think that erodes society. I don't think that says that there isn't a role for charity and society and community groups to come together. I don't think that's arguing for the monopoly of the state on all aspects of our life. I think it's just saying, look, when it comes to the fundamentals of avoiding destitution, that's not something I want to my neighbour to feel a sense of responsibility for me, although they probably will feel a sense of, I want to help where I can, dignity and agency being very important. But I think, Richard, I don't know whether it was a deliberate point you were making or it was a slip of the tongue, but you used the word agency interchangeably with money. And actually, that's really true. You put money in people's hands, they have agency over where they spend it, and they're able to come together to thrive. And when they come together in warm spaces, I think that's absolutely a critical point. And when it comes to the kind of things that government could be doing, recognising that when community groups and their assets are being used for the good of the community, and where the market would break against community coming together to meet one another's needs and be spaces of welcome, then there are things the state can do to say, hang on, the edge of the market isn't helping society thrive, let's intervene on that bit of the market. And Conservative government of many, many years ago may be really resistant to that, but they've intervened in the market in the most major way to intervene and say, hang on, the energy bills for a particular set of society might need a particular second look at. And the 6 months of help for charities and churches is really welcome, but it could be extended, that where you're demonstrably providing that kind of help in a community, then those costs could be addressed. Suicide prevention work in anti-poverty work. Yeah, I mean, anti-poverty work is suicide prevention work by extension, but there is a way that we can do it that actively works to be a suicide prevention strategy. There's a way we can do it that doesn't help. When we draw false equivalencies between when this thing happens, suicides go up, so this thing causes suicides, that's really dangerous. And friends at Samaritans and others are really helpful to us in the third sector, being very careful about the stories we tell about suicidality and mental health challenges. I'm really grateful. But one of the key things that we do in practice, so the policy thing is careful of the stories you tell. The practice thing is embedding in our services, exactly as Emma was describing in food banks, space to talk. The space to be listened, heard, looked in the eye, seen as a human rather than a recipient of a service or unit of production. When we treat one another as humans, having experienced a suicide survivor myself, when you're treated as a human and seen and heard, suicidality tends to dissipate, and that's a life you just save by even just listening to them and looking them in the eye. And so there's a really important part in the anti-poverty movement to make sure we get our policy and our practice shooting at that too, because human life really matters. That's the whole point of this panel.
Professor Jang, and just sorry, quickly, I just want to say that please do keep it brief.
There's lots of hands I saw, so I will keep it brief. I just wanted to say, I mean, I'm very impressed by that, and have been over the COVID and the cost of living, how much the communities do come together. I mean, there is such a lot, and Emma's figures about the number of people in food bank, you're talking about what Christians Against Poverty, and so I'm not sure I'd accept your premise that there's a broken bit in society. I think there's a lot of really important voluntary activity goes on, and it plays a very important role. I do worry a little bit about the discourse that so much promotes paid work for everyone, and Emma picked up on this point as well. Because what you're then is undervaluing that other contribution that people make to society, and those other contributions are really important and make a big difference as well. So I think we can go too far down that road that says paid work is the contribution. There are many other ways to contribute, and they're very important as well.
Very good.
Thank you. We are actually approaching time, so just to introduce a very quick question to everyone on the panel, because I think there's a lot of agreement, but also a lot of ground we have covered. So if there was one single policy that would make most difference, because we know that countries are constrained, to make a difference this winter, what would it be? What do you think it is? And if you can just state the policy very briefly, what do you think it is? And I'll start with Emma.
This winter?
Yes, this winter.
Reduced deductions from working age benefits.
Thank you. Richard.
Very difficult. There's so many, multitude of things that can be done. I would say, keep it relevant in today's debate. I'd bring forward the increase in the universal credit benefits and other benefits that is supposed to take place in April next year to as soon as possible, and I would have it in line with inflation, at least.
Thank you.
Demand side reduction on energy bills, so make people's homes more efficient.
Thank you. Robin?
I'm going to duck that one because actually, for two very good reasons. One is I'm learning as I listen to this, and the second thing is the group that I listen to most closely is constituents. We did a drop-in worried about winter event, and we're rolling that around the constituency. Did that last week. 75 people through the door. half a dozen more, probably closer to a dozen, in absolute distress at that point, able to help with practical stuff. So actually listening to what they're saying, to what some of the comments here from experts who are really on that front line about what might work, and feed that into the debates that will happen within government. But as a freebie, and as we're throwing stones into the pond, as it were, I really want to pick up on what Gareth said there, that point about being economic units of production. I think one of the big problems we have got within the West is that we are each framed in policy terms as units of economic production and consumption. And right there, I think, are a lot of the problems to do with suicide, to do with our understanding of work as being paid employment. I couldn't agree more. This is so important. And I think this underpins and feeds into so many of the problems we have. Enough said.
Thank you. Professor.
Well, I sort of set out my policy stall earlier, didn't I? So
Yes.
I think so. You know,
But just one.
We need the inflation increase at the minimum, possibly more than that. I'm going to keep with the child benefit point. I think it's really important that we think about the future of our children. So I think that is a very important policy measure. And I absolutely agree with Emma about deductions. When we talk to families on universal credit, that is a big factor. That you don't know what deductions are going to be taken for your benefit, so you don't know what you're going to get. You can't possibly plan even in the short term, never mind the longer term.
Thank you. And finally, Gareth.
I'm going to agree with everything that's come before. The one other thing that could be done, we could ban the forcible installation of prepayment meters, whether by warrant and entry or by smart meter, so that nobody need fear coming off of supply this winter. Nobody should need to freeze and die. We can deal with debts an awful lot easier than we can with deaths.
Thank you. Thank you very much all for coming, and thank you to all the speakers who attended this event, and thank you for Christians Against Poverty for partnering with us. You're welcome to remain in the room and mingle. There is some networking time, and I think there's still some catering, and I am obligated to tell you that we are running a special offer on becoming a Bribe Blue member for a discounted offer of just £10 for a year, and if you can find one of our members of staff at the back, they'll be able to help you. We still have a number of Fringe events running this afternoon, so if you have some free time, please do come and join, and once again, thank you all for coming.